looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. In today's video, I want to talk post-traumatic stress disorder again, and more importantly, I want to talk about the 3 zones of post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll call PTSD from this point, which correlate to the self-defense mechanisms, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and we're going to look at this in depth. So to do this, we're going to look at a truly iconic movie character who I didn't love massively in Jurassic Park, but totally clicked with in its sequel, The Lost World, the one and only Ian Malcolm. Now, for today's video, we're looking at The Lost World pretty much in isolation and not any other film he was in, as his character developed PTSD following the events of Jurassic Park, and, in terms of Jurassic World Dominion, that was just an awful film where he was there for little more than nostalgia, so there's nothing to draw or add from that particular movie. Anyway, let's crack on. Ian Malcolm was the chaos theory scientist in Jurassic Park who was arrogant, fancied himself as a ladies' man, and nearly ended up as T-Rex meat. He got seriously injured by the T-Rex and, like everyone else, barely made it out of the island alive. I noticed that, and this is partly Goldblum, but also the nuance of the character, Malcolm hid everything behind a joke in the original, and, even at the most serious moments, his quipping was about using humour to metabolise the sheer horror of what was going on. Actually, I think the only time he was serious was when they were sat down at the dinner table and he gave his "didn't stop to think whether they should" speech. Now, many people use humour as a way to break the ice and also cope with stressful situations, and the psychological statistics are that these people are generally extroverted, open to experience and agreeable, and the humour also helps build a resilience. Sometimes making light of everything can be a sign of being frightened, as repeated minimalising of situations can withdraw you from it. However, humour expert Andrew Tarvin, and yes, there is a thing called a humour expert, wrote in Psychology Today that humour in stressful situations works via the paradigm of the 4 R's, which are: number 1, reject. Ignore the stressor or place it in a box where it can be minimised and laughed at. Number 2, reframe. Some things are unavoidable, so it's best to look at it through a completely different prism and make it something connotatively new. Number 3, relieve. After the rejection and reframing, move along to something which completely sinks the stressful event. A good example of this is Ian's continuous flirting with Ellie Sattler in between the tension and build-up of both arriving to the island and going on the first, well, what turns out to be non-eventful, dinosaur trek. Number 4, refresh. This is about doing something completely different. Now, on a dinosaur island, it's hard to do something completely different as everything is focused on that and you can't really leave and escape. But a lot of the time with refresh, it's about changing topics completely. However, by the time we meet Malcolm in The Lost World, Jurassic Park sequel, he is a completely different person to what he was in the first film. Yes, there are still moments of humour, but overall, he now limps from his T-Rex-induced leg injury, is more confrontational, and prophesises pessimism and gets angered more easily. Now, the reason for this is that after being nearly eaten alive and then having his legitimate concerns quashed by InGen, the company that makes the dinosaurs, Malcolm is left suffering from PTSD. So what is PTSD? Or, to give it its full name as we said at the start, post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, according to Mind UK, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health problem which develops after experiencing traumatic events. The condition was first recognised in war veterans when they came back from battle. However, it has had different names in the past, such as shell shock, but it's not only diagnosed in soldiers. A wide range of traumatic experiences in any field of life can cause PTSD. Basically, when something traumatic happens in your life, it rocks you to the foundations of your personality, sense of security, and can leave you with heightened anxiety, emotional flashbacks, nightmares, and panic attacks. The world is no longer a safe place, it instead becomes somewhere that bad things can and do happen. Someone with PTSD often relives the traumatic event through nightmares and flashbacks and may experience feelings of isolation, irritability, and guilt. They may also have problems sleeping, such as insomnia, and find concentrating difficult, and these symptoms are often severe and persist enough to have a significant impact on the person's day-to-day life. Now, we don't need to go into what caused Ian Malcolm's PTSD. He was nearly killed by a T-Rex and, all in all, was put in a position where he nearly died because of one man's spared no expense arrogance. However, for sufferers of PTSD, there are 3 zones which are always fluctuated between. So these 3 zones are, number 1, the hyper-arousal zone. Symptoms of this are being emotionally overwhelmed, racing thoughts, feeling unsafe, poor sleep, hypervigilance, intrusive images, unable to rest, tight muscles, anxiety, panic, defensiveness, and all this is activated by the sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response. Then we come to the second zone, the optimal arousal zone. Symptoms of this are feeling open and curious, awareness of boundaries, our reactions adapt to fit situations, and we become empathic. This is our window of tolerance. It's where our high level of functioning exists. Basically, our day-to-day life, work, meeting people, relationships, all this happens in the optimal arousal zone. Finally, we come to the third zone, the hypo-arousal zone. Now, symptoms of this are depression, emotional numbness, emptiness, disconnection, low energy, mental shutdown, lethargy, and blank stares. Now, the hypoarousal zone is activated by the parasympathetic nervous system's freeze response. Now, to clarify, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for activating the fight or flight response with increasing heart rates, activating adrenaline, suppressing insulin, and getting you ready to run or attack. And in our first zone, this is where PTSD is at its most volatile. Ian Malcolm shows this many ways throughout the Lost World, but it starts when he sees John Hammond and is told there is another island with dinosaurs and his girlfriend Sarah has been sent there. Entering the hyper-arousal zone, Ian's mind immediately connects all the images as Hammond talks about the new island, and you can see his body language change. He stiffens, rubs his face, stammers a little, and starts reliving the dinosaurs in his mind, but it's when he meets Mr. Ludlow, the real villain of the Lost World, and they enter a confrontation where his experiences are belittled by Mr. Ludlow, and all of a sudden Malcolm really changes. As I always say, non-verbal communication is 70% of all communication, and watch Ian's demeanour go between fear and anger by stiffening and absolute irresolution to move. He literally stands his ground without a twitch. Starting to argue, his voice changes tone, body solidifies into attack, and he becomes more aggressive and even grabs Ludlow sharply and reminds him of the pain he's been through with one simple line. All the racing thoughts and intrusive images are present, and Malcolm has now firmly moved from the optimal zone, where we have seen him on the train at the start looking fairly relaxed, and also when he first starts talking to Hammond, and he is now in the hyper-arousal zone, where his aggression towards Ludlow is projected from an experience he hasn't really dealt with, and he's really restraining himself from either lashing out or shouting as his experiences are being belittled. Belittling someone's experiences when they have PTSD is one of the worst things you can do. You're dismissing it, you're denying it. That person lives in a hyper-arousal zone of reality which is frightening. If you turn around and minimise it, or say, I'm sure it wasn't that bad, or shut up, or whatever, it completely changes their psychology. Now, once on the dinosaur island, Ian is still in hyper-arousal mode at all times as he dodges dinosaurs and continues to relay his experiences or project pessimism onto the pillagers and the people who go with him who are trying to take or save the dinosaurs. Racked by trauma, he no longer jokes at everything and even snaps at Pete Postlethwaite's alpha male hunter when he quips about his friend Eddie's death. Ian is no longer the well-kempt joker who hides behind a veneer of sarcasm and one-liners. Quite literally, look at him. Go back to non-verbal communication. He's unshaven. He's slightly bedraggled. He doesn't look the same confident man he was in the original Jurassic Park. He's now world-weary, riddled with physical and mental scars, and also fearing for his daughter and girlfriend who are stuck on the island with him. Malcolm prophesies the worst scenarios throughout the film. He tells Vince Vaughn, "This isn't amazing, it's the start of something bad." He warns Mr. Ludlow that removing dinosaurs is the worst idea in the long, sad history of bad ideas, and he constantly jibes at Sarah's enthusiasm, stating she is naive and doesn't know what's really coming. This is all hyper-arousal as emotional flashbacks collide with the present and, now reliving the past but no longer in a random environment where the panic is irrational and uncontrolled, he is in the environment which has caused all this, and so he starts to suffer the true effects of the hyper-arousal zone. Those true effects of angry outbursts, fear, flashbacks, tension and shaking, feeling unsafe, tight muscles, anxiety, panic, defensiveness. It's also worth noting that just before the T-Rexes attack the camp, Ian is so lost in the hyper-arousal zone that he has another symptom: insomnia. It's Ian who's wide awake. It's Ian who notices the footsteps. "I'm fairly alarmed here," he says, as the water ripples and ripples. And it's Ian who watches in paralysis as the T-Rex puts its head in Sarah's tent. Now, Ian isn't in the hypo-arousal zone of freeze here. What he's going through is a different type of freeze, and it comes from the 4 Fs that we discussed in the Rick Grimes video, and we'll come to it later. Here, Ian is still in sympathetic nervous system drive, but overcome with fear at the thing which nearly killed him, his fight or flight hits freeze and he cannot move, doesn't shout out, and just stammers in terror as he expects Sarah and Kelly to be eaten. Remember, we have 4 F defense mechanisms: fight, flight, fawn and freeze, and in moments of high stress, regardless if you've got PTSD or not, you enter one of those Fs. Ian, he's currently stuck in freeze, can't move, can't think, doesn't know what to do, feels helpless. He's just frozen. Like I said, it's slightly different to the freeze in the hypo-arousal, but we're coming to that. Earlier in the film, when talking to his daughter, Ian is snappy, cross and furious she is there, but upon hearing that first T-Rex roar echo through the jungle, Malcolm's face says it all and he goes full adrenaline and hyper-arousal. Goldblum plays the scene brilliantly, and from this moment on, we see the effects of PTSD brilliantly as he abseils down without slowing the rope mechanism, runs into the trailer, and then has to face 2 T-Rexes as they slowly bully and destroy the trailer. Remember, hyper-arousal is all about fear, and gone is the arrogant man from the first film now, and now fueled by memories and the capacity to understand what these creatures can do, Malcolm is a walking shadow of the confidence which soaked the screen in Jurassic Park, and he is now in a constant state of dread that something bad is going to happen. Also, when something bad does happen, watch him revel in it. Watch him say, "Didn't I tell you so?" So let's come to hypo-arousal. Well, in terms of hypo-arousal, this happens once the stressful event is over and, to restore homeostasis, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Now, it's called parasympathetic because, after all that velocity and mental freefall, we need a parachute to slow us down and return to homeostasis. So therefore, parasympathetic nervous system. It's quite literally an emotional and mental parachute which opens. Okay, so remember, the hypo-arousal zone deals with depression, emotional numbness, emptiness, disconnection, low energy, mental shutdown, lethargy, blank stares. So, as the parasympathetic nervous system lowers blood pressure, slows digestion, and the need for urination and defecation decreases and muscles become relaxed, the parasympathetic nervous system generally is what all therapists want to trigger when using mindfulness or getting you to breathe slowly. However, for PTSD, this can put you in a zone where once the adrenaline has been used up and all that anger and fear has burned out, then something has to take its place. Emotions work a lot like a rocket engine. You see, they ignite, fire up and burn hot, but like everything, they don't maintain this intensity forever and eventually burn out. So, now left with the residue of exhaustion, The hypo-arousal zone has lots of negative emotions, as things like low blood sugar and low energy and general mental disconnection leaves people to think they are experiencing everything on their own, and they sink into the opposite of hyper. They go hypo and they can feel very, very isolated and withdrawn. Ian doesn't really enter the hypo-arousal zone much in The Lost World, although we do see him physically exhausted, but he shows signs when leaving the island and seeing the Rex has been captured. Fully aware that the nightmare will continue elsewhere, now back on the mainland as Ludlow's nightmare is about to actualise itself, the relief of his and his family's safety is mixed with dread, depression and disconnection, as he knows that, whilst they're currently safe, there's a lot more problems to come. After all the drama and heartache from his escape and final confrontation with the velociraptors, it's natural he would be exhausted, but even when they enter San Diego and we enter the final chaotic case with the T-Rex, Ian returns to something more Malcolm-like as he gains more control and, whilst bordering on the hyper-arousal zone, he appears to return to the optimal arousal zone, his highest level of functioning. Now remember, the optimal arousal zone is where sufferers of PTSD can function at their highest, and its symptoms are feeling open and curious, awareness of boundaries, reactions to adapt and fit situations, and also becoming empathic. Basically, what happens is the fear of fight and flight in the limbic system is switched off, and the frontal lobe logical reasoning comes in. So people are able to bond, socialise, and also solve problems a lot more easy because there's less adrenaline and less panic. Ian joins Sarah at the dock as the T-Rex is about to arrive, and he's very jocular and jokey, but even when the Rex then escapes, he isn't lost in depression or angry and aggressive. He snarls a bit at Ludlow that he's been proved right, but then sets about problem solving, being proactive and leading the charge in getting the Rex back onto the boat. Feeling empathy, connected, safe and adapting to the situation like a duck to water, Malcolm isn't being pessimistic, he isn't frozen with fear, and he isn't being snappy or aggressive, and his laid back and humorous side appears to have returned a little. Maybe it's because he's in a territory he knows, not one that triggers his anxiety. Maybe it's because Kelly is safe and he is mentally and physically replenished. After all, they probably had something to eat and drink and had a bit of a snooze on the way back. Or maybe it's because that lovely feeling of self-righteousness we all get when we're proved right about something we've been banging on for ages finally comes true. It gives that wonderful sense of ego inflation. I told you so. It's a lovely word to say when you've been proved right. Either way, Ian is in the optimal arousal zone, and now, despite being as vigilant and aware of a T-Rex chasing you as you can be when you're in a car with its baby, he would never have been able to save the day, trap the Rex and restore balance to the Lost World if he'd been in the other two zones. Had he been hyper-aroused, he would have been irrational, his logical thoughts blocked by limbic brain thinking, and he would have been too agitated and panic-stricken to help. And if he would have been hypo-aroused, he would have been too withdrawn, down and far too pessimistic to help out, but optimally zoned, he is aware, vigilant, his frontal lobe can think, and now that his sympathetic nervous system and limbic system isn't overrun and he can think, act and navigate, he can trap the Rex, all with some humour and a bit of calmness thrown in along the way. PTSD is a natural and real disorder for people who've been through harrowing situations or come close to death, and it's activated by environment, images, words and random situations, and when these triggers go off, it's hard to function, or even when you are able to function, your personality changes and you can become a completely different person. As Resmaa Menakem said, trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. And you can see Ian's personality in the hyper-arousal zone changes so much from what he used to be and how he is at the start of the film when he has to act and deal with things. Trauma changes us. It's a very profound experience, and whilst we all phase in and out of functioning, our characteristics, the way we interact and our attitudes all get twisted out of shape when struggling either side of the optimal arousal zone. Basically, our trauma's in control of us rather than the other way around. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. Remember, psychology is cool, so please like, share and subscribe, or even leave a comment or make a suggestion for a future video. And until next time, I'll catch you later.
In a few weeks' time, they'll be long forgotten.
Not by me.